Cool. So I didn't really have slides, but I do have this lovely Voronoi diagram, which I suggest you sort of look at, gaze into peacefully as I give my talk, and then let the dulcet tones of my voice lull you to sleep, so you don't have to notice what I'm saying. The talk is called Fracturing Monocultures with Non-Traditional Community Models. I'm not actually necessarily a game critic. I don't think of myself that way, and yet games criticism comes in many different forms. In an antidisciplinary sort of framework, we can think about games criticism being games or music, or the conversations that we have with each other. All of these frameworks count. And so when we talk about communities, oftentimes, as has been mentioned before, they tend to form almost sort of spontaneously because we're searching for each other, we're looking for connections, and then they go online. But this isn't enough to make it stable or necessarily healthy. I think that when this happens, if you start to let it progress in this natural way, you can lead to gatekeeping. You can lead to a type of monoculture where everyone thinks that they want the same thing or are headed in the same direction. And this is problematic because within games creation, you see this same sort of bubbling concoction occurring all across the world, in Ireland and South Africa, currently happening in Malaysia and in Australia, which is where I'm from. So a lot of my personal experience comes from this game's creation aspect. Where's the community at, and what are the problems that it faces? And considering how some of these problems and solutions that we found might translate to games criticism, because ultimately they can be viewed in some, sort of same way. I co-direct a conference called Free Play, which is Australia's largest and longest running independent games festival. And the other part of this is that I also founded a number of smaller playful arts groups. One is called Glitchmark, another is called Play Reactive, which focuses on physical activity. All of these things have small little goals, little sub-cultures and communities that people are interested in, and yet they're united not under an umbrella but via Wittgensteinian branches, that the relationship between games as framework or games as lens rather than what games are inherently binds them in common culture, so that we can have the same vocabulary, or not even have the same vocabulary, and still gain insight from talking about these issues. One of the things that frequently comes up is how do we balance critical engagement with maker culture? There's a seeming tension between the doing and the thinking. And when it comes to games criticism, sometimes it feels like the doing is so distributed that makers feel like their work isn't really getting anywhere. It isn't actually affecting any change. And yet we know this not to be true within critical discourse. We know that the vocabulary is changing very slowly. We can start talking about kyriarchy, about intersectionality in places which previously, you just get complete blank faces. So this is good. We're seeing a lot of progress. But I think that within games, especially, the umbrella model has unfortunately prevailed in some ways. We see huge communities of people that are tied up with the identity of the group without thinking about how they themselves could possibly influence it. We see a permission culture where they're waiting for somebody to let them know that, yes, it's okay to take charge in this direction, or they're waiting to see if it's okay to make a stance that's somewhat different from the status quo. And we know that we can change this because this is what we do on a daily basis when we have our conversations, when we have things like critical proximity. It comes from non-traditional community models. Traditionally, community models might be seen as like you have a village, you come together, and within that you have lots of subgroups of friends, and you choose who your acquaintances are, but you also have the larger model, which is that everyone accepts the etiquette of we live in the same village, we all have the same rule set of you can't kill everyone, we have this legal system. And the same sort of system is applied to online communities and to meeting groups in real life. But because that structure doesn't actually come from a specific place, it sort of just appears and then is socially navigated by, the way that it evolves generally goes to the base denominator. It doesn't actually achieve a sort of an enlightenment by itself. You really have to add potential energy by individuals. And this is where the enlightenment of specific individuals contributing to the community is so important for the health of the community. Because it isn't about the geniuses, it is about the genius. This is a hard word to say because I just learned it. It is about sort of getting everybody up to a certain standard and beyond so that we can get everybody across that line and future people can learn from all the mistakes that we're making now. Whereas now it's very much about looking at specific people, whether they be role models or idols, whether they be people that we look to because our metrics of success that we're celebrating aren't actually analyzed. So in Australia, this is, for example, the most financially successful people, which is obviously not a great way to learn about ethics. Whereas, elsewhere in criticism, we look at people who have the most interesting things to say in the forum, and we have to look at people who are making the most interesting statements socially. There's a huge overlap, as Maddie Bryce pointed out. And this is really good. This is what we want to see. More fracturing in a really positive sense, like the fractures of a stained glass window, where each individual piece is beautiful, but together we add up to a picture that's much larger than ourselves. And this fracturing can't come from this top god-like person. There is no such person in control. It's a personal revolution where we each contribute invisibly. And it doesn't even happen at GDC or at places which you might think it happens. It happens when you look stuff up on the internet, get personally informed, and then become critically engaged, and you have a discourse that reaches a density in real life. So what I can encourage you guys to do then is when you go back home, wherever home may be physically, you also find those people that are there already in the community making large changes or small changes, and then get them together and activate that space to create something that is unlike what we already have. Because only through experimenting with the mode of communities can we then find out what is going wrong and right and what we can change and do differently. Instead of meeting every week in a specific place, maybe you choose to do something else entirely. One thing that we tried and completely failed was something called Hopping Melbourne. The concept was to bring together people of extremely different interests, various wide, diverse backgrounds. And we didn't really want to say disciplines, but it was this interdisciplinary salon-like thing. A salon in the French Enlightenment sense of the term, when people would come to usually a woman's place and sort of sit down and talk about issues with a point of either educating or pleasing. And we tried to emulate that, but we also wanted to put a situationist dérive style sort of wandering to it because we wanted to try something different. And so what we did was said, we'll meet up at this time, 4 p.m., and then every half hour we're going to move to a completely new location in the city and let that journey as well as the new location inspire us. And we tried to do this because we thought if we just get down and sit down in a cafe, then you sit down to next people you know and you don't necessarily get up and be inspired by different places. So maybe the place has something to do with what you talk about. And we decided that, yeah, okay, we're going to mix this up. And when it happened, it was beautiful and it was ephemeral. It was, we had discussions about how cooking and textile design influenced games. You don't get to hear that as much as we should hear about it, right? We want to hear about how Japanese cuisine and French cuisine are similar to jazz in Spelunky. Like those sorts of topics that actually occurred enriched my understanding of all of these, strange and nebulous concepts, and yet we don't hear about it normally. So maybe these things occur only when we experiment with a form of community as well. The next step to this is fracturing can also lead to death. Hopping Melbourne no longer exists. You can go to the website, and it tells you that our last meeting was in like July of 2012 or something like that. And that's okay. It's okay for communities to die. If a community doesn't want to die, you can end up with people clinging to the last vestiges of power. You can leave people hungry for a leader that doesn't actually have the community at best interest. They sort of just want that power structures because they've been used to it, and people look to them because they're the ones that have always been in charge. And then you end up with large organizations with 4 letters in their acronym. And so the way that we think about how communities might be able to die is basically letting people create these subcultures without being silos, and then recognizing that all these media are completely constructed and false. We don't have to form a gamer culture because games are just a lens. We don't have to save the industry because, first of all, they're their own thing, and the industry doesn't exist because it's a cluster concept, and a clusterfuck of one at that. So we'll look at, instead, creating stained glass windows. Instead of spiders with the head controlling the body, or even starfish, where even though you cut off an arm, another grows, but it still has one mouth. We look towards creating an entire ecosystem, a rainforest. And that can only thrive when we experiment with new genetic material, so we should all become scientists. Okay, thank you.